argument against that hemp legislation? Well,
Please, would you please repeat the question?
Sure,
Because
sure.
you're sitting behind the person.
Yeah, so the question was the argument about the hemp bill. And of course, I can't imagine why there was an argument against the hemp bill. But I've been trying to bring hemp legislation ever since I went to Boise. And I told Tom Trail he was ahead of his time, as it's been kind of coming across the United States in waves, and because the 2014 Farm Bill allowed for hemp research. So what the big game changer was, the 2018 Farm Bill allows for hemp production. So 122, when I drafted it in December, right after the president signed the Farm Bill into law, was just a straight conformity with the federal guidelines around the Farm Bill. And it took it off of the Schedule 1 of illegal substances, the definition, which is the plant has to have less than 0.3% of THC in it. Well, that was all fine and good until law enforcement figured out that the dogs weren't going to work anymore. And they were pretty good about it until they figured that out, and then all hell broke loose because of the dogs. Hemp went to the dogs. Because in Idaho, it's been, forever, thumbs up, it's marijuana or it's not marijuana, and there's no gray area whatsoever. So I was asked to work with law enforcement and come up with some compromises that would work for our prosecuting attorneys and for law enforcement, because Idaho is still very resistant to marijuana. And that hasn't changed, and we charge them with with ensuring that our laws are enforced. And so we spent many weeks. I think the 122 was initially introduced in February 11th, and we negotiated all of these changes, I got that new bill RS'd, but it was kind of past the point where you could introduce it in committee, so I had to get the committee chairman to sign off on the RS slip, and she wouldn't sign off on it. And she said, we're going to vote on the straight 122. So we voted on that in committee, 122, and it went to the floor, and it passed the floor 63-7. So it passed very strong support from the House, but none of the changes that law enforcement had worked and I had worked so diligently on. And so went over to the Senate, and the Senate put those amendments that we had worked on into 122, came back to the House, and it got stuck at the Speaker's chair. And they took out the language that was just the transportation component of it, because we're going to have a commerce issue if we don't start allowing hemp to come through the state once the federal rules are promulgated this fall. So that language was taken out and put into House Bill 300. It was initially given to the chairman of the Ag Committee, Representative Boyle, to carry, and they added me to be a joint sponsor of that bill. And that went to the House without any language about hemp production in it whatsoever. Passed out of the House, went over to the Senate, and got amended in the Senate. And hemp production was magically put back in it. And so it came back to the House, House Bill 300 as amended in the Senate. And I have to say, Senator Abby Lee was just delightful to work with on this, and Senator Grant Burgoyne, both great champions over on the Senate side. And so they sent it back over, and it was towards the waning days of the session, and I was informed that my bill is going to be a victim of the disagreement between the House and the Senate. And so when it went to the Transportation Committee for concurrence with the amendments, the Transportation Committee did not concur, and it died on the House floor. So such was the trials and tribulations of hemp in Idaho this year. I think it was greatly disappointing. A lot of folks put a lot of effort into it, and our farmers really want this. Commodity prices are low. This is a very interesting crop. I had spoken a couple of years ago to Clearwater Paper about whether hemp fiber would be something that they could process at their facilities, and I learned all about how their digesters work down there, and they don't work for hemp. But you know, I think we have some great opportunities in Idaho, and we're one of the top-rated states and top agricultural production areas in the world for seed production. And right now in Oregon, they are paying between $1 and $1.50 per seed to grow hemp, and a seed the size of a mustard seed. And you know, down in the Magic Valley and the Treasure Valley, they can raise seed that is renowned across the globe. And we could be doing hemp production in Idaho for seed and really have a real great niche for that. And it just didn't happen. So it's very disappointing. I've asked the Attorney General's office for an opinion on whether or not the governor could just ask his state director for ag to do a plan without legislative direction. And so I'm waiting to hear back from the AG's office. So that's the story of hemp.
As we anticipate, we have some kind of resistance toward urban renewal and tax increment financing through the legislature, and I know that there are some particular projects in southern Idaho that may be the cause of this year's disagreement. But what are your expectations for next session as relate to urban renewal?
I have to say I have no idea, Nancy. I mean, that seemed to be a spat between Boise and the legislature, the legislative leadership to changes this year. I know Senator Johnson was fairly involved within it and also has resistance to allowing significant funding without a vote, but I have no idea what's going to happen next year.
And the legislation improved. So the initial legislation that came forward said that if any tax dollars whatsoever were being spent, even if it was down to like $500, that it would have to go to a vote. Well, think of all the little projects that the libraries do or the schools do, and that just became a little bit ridiculous. And so I think the compromise bill was a good compromise, and it put a dollar limit on that. And you are correct, it was definitely a tussle between the city of Boise and the legislature, because the city of Boise, a couple things, their new library I think is something like $80 million library, and then they want to do a sports complex without a taxpayer vote. And I think I heard from a lot of folks from Boise about how important it was, this piece of legislation. So there does have to be some guidelines there. It's going to be an ongoing, it's really going to be an ongoing issue. You know, one of the things that I started down the road of last year, I'm on the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee, which is really interesting because you can bring issues that you think are concerning to the state, to the Legislative Oversight Committee, and they'll do a really deep dive into the issue. And so last year, I asked about unintended consequences of legislation on county budgets. I'd like to do counties and cities and school districts and highway districts, but kind of have to start someplace because it's a pretty big thing to figure out. And it's very clear that we're making big decisions in the Idaho legislature that impact your property taxes, and we don't have a clear understanding of that we're doing that with our legislation. So I'm hoping that the outcome of that is that we'll do a better job of really understanding the impacts that we're making on cities and on counties with these unfunded mandates, which of course the state hates, the Fed's doing to us, so why would we behave any differently of what we hate the most? And quit passing along all these costs to these local municipalities and allow them to spend the money that they're raising through their property taxes in the way that makes the most sense to them. And so I think we really need to do a better job of revamping our fiscal impacts for all of our legislation so that we can say, this is what it's costing the highway district or the school district or whatever it is, and we then have to take a step back and say, is this really worth the cost that we're putting on those municipalities? That was an interesting battle. And what was hard for us is that Gary Michael, who is, interim president at the U of I, was leading the charge on that. So Gary was sitting up in the gallery and watching down on us, making sure that we were paying attention to him.
I have a question here, and I'd address it to Senator Nelson, just because, David, you and I have talked about this before. We're talking about Idaho income tax here, and the income tax, they start with using the federal tax form, adjusted gross income, and there was a big question, there has been a big question, is how was this going to affect Idaho's income as far as, because there was a massive tax cut last year in the federal government, which would cause a lot of people's adjusted gross income to be different this year than it has been in the past. Do we know what impact that has been, or is it too early?
It's been a big question in the legislative session on what it did do that. So we did a tax cut 2 years ago when we conformed, and I think that was scheduled to essentially cut taxes by about $200 million. It was going to go up by 100, so sort of a net 100 down. The big wild card in the session was withholdings. On our tax withholding during the year, how was that had essentially been screwed up by all this, okay? Because it's really the difference between deductions and exemptions, and in the end, many of us were withholding not enough money. And so our tax revenue through the whole year, and Representative Nielsen on JFAC, you guys were dealing with that the whole time, it was down. And so we kept looking at down money. And the real place when we're going to know this is in the next month or two when people do file their taxes, and they file them on April 15th, and we see how that revenue recovers. At the end of March, I believe we were down about $100 million. I think that's the number. Yeah. So do we recover, and do we recover a lot and maybe have a surplus? It definitely put a lot of questions in there. In the end, the tax commission has set up their own form that we need to fill out now to more properly calculate our withholdings. We used to correlate very well with the federal government. What we don't now, and we need essentially our own W-2. So if you haven't filled that out, and if you haven't updated your withholdings, go do so, because the problem hasn't gone away until you correct your withholdings.
I think it's even more of a problem in that people expected, I think there was 40-some thousand taxpayers that historically had gotten a refund, and so they were expecting that same refund. And as many of us do, when you have a refund coming, what do? Especially around Christmas and things like that, we spend it. So right after the first of the year, all of a sudden they start saying, well, I'm going to start doing my taxes now, and I've got to start sending a check in instead of a check. So not only was that impact there, but guess what people did? They stopped spending. So that was a further decrease in the state sales tax. So it was a long-range problem. And it could be even better or even worse this year, because we were talking only 6 months last year. We're now talking 12 months. So if people do not take that necessary step, and please, use the new form. Don't use the same form that you're using for the federal, because it's significantly different. It will again put you under withholding if you use the federal form. So it impacted us, and I think it's going to continue to impact us. because there was a couple bills I would love to run. And the first step was, when I talked to the chairman of the JFAC, says, not this year, we don't have the money. And so, until we find out, and I have a feeling it may not, Dave, correct itself here in April. I think people may say, I'm just gonna take an extension and try to catch up some money. We may be August before we really see the full effect of under withholding.